Hello, my name is Bethany, and today I am going to be talking about the transformation of praise and worship music. And believe it or not, it started in the era of the hippies, because everybody was trying to find themselves, who they were, and they're experimenting in many different things, and a lot of them actually decided to become Christians. So one of the churches in Costa Mesa, California, Calvary Chapel, they decided to hire one of the former hippies, if you can call them former hippies, and his name was Lonnie, and they asked him to go out and to minister to other hippies, bring in the youth, see if he could gather people like him and bring them into the church. He started doing this, and he was bringing in hundreds of children and young people and runaways and drug addicts and all these kind of hippies that were flocking, trying to discover who they were. And there were so many homeless people and runaways and all these kind of people who just didn't know where they belonged. And so the church started building these houses and different, they started calling them communes. And the kids would stay there, and they would go to church, and they would just do this nonstop. And there was multiple church services and heavy Bible studies. But the problem was, even though the preaching was excellent, and even though everybody was on this new spiritual kick, they couldn't stand the worship music. One of the former hippies explained that he would show up late just to miss the worship music. He wanted to hear about the Bible and wanted the Word of God, but he was bored with the worship music. So instead of kind of just taking it as it was, they decided to start just doing their own worship in these communes. They would play songs, put gospel words to the songs of jingles, to Coca-Cola and other different commercials that they heard on TV, and they started their whole kind of new brand of worship music. And eventually this began to work its way into the Calvary Chapel. They would show some of their songs. And then they introduced the guitar. Shocking, I know. And then they started introducing other things. And from this, a new worship style began to grow. And from this new worship style, the pastor, whose name is Chuck Smith, decided to put his own money on the line, and he created a record. And they called it Maranatha. And they made another record. And from these beginnings, humble beginnings, they started their own small production company. From this production company, they also started making their own sheet music. From the sheet music, they started selling this all over the world. And it started kind of picking up a little. Not as much as they would hoped, because there were still many traditionalists who wanted to stick to the old ways. But it was picking up. And then in the, I want to say 90s, with the Promise Keepers, this new style of worship music had spread. And a lot of the pastors who went to Promise Keepers were a little bit skeptical, because drums, guitar, piano, all mixed together. Isn't that like rock music? Can we do this? But it hit a spiritual chord with them. It hit not just spiritual, but a deep emotional chord. And from this, they began to take it back to their churches. And it got even bigger. The only problem is, like I mentioned before, the traditionalists. They didn't like the change. They thought that electric guitar was too radical, that drums were too radical. They didn't want this. It was too secular. What was going on? Why can't we just keep it the way it was? And there was almost like a praise and worship war going on with these churches. Some churches had to do two separate worship services. One for the more modern take, and then one for the people who wanted to keep it traditional. Some had to do a compromise, and with the compromise, they played some traditional and they played some more modern. And but it was hard for the bands in the beginning. It was hard for them. Like I said, there was a lot of traditional issues, people in the church, but it wasn't just the church. They didn't find a place where they could fit in. You had bands that were not secular and Christian, but the secular people didn't want to listen to it. And because they were too secular, the churches and other Christians didn't want to buy it. I remember one of the conversations I had with my aunt back in the early 90s. there was a band that came out. I wish I could remember the band, but it was a ska band. And they had taken hymn music, the old traditional songs, and put it to ska music. And she caught me listening to this. And she was so angry that I was listening to this music. She thought it was blasphemy. And I explained to her that I was tired of the old school hymnal music. It was just boring. At that time, our church had one organ player and I believe one piano player. And that was it. And we only played hymnals. And so when I heard this, and it had the songs from the hymnals, and it had this fantastic music behind it, I was ecstatic. But she couldn't stand it. But when I explained it to her that I needed something different, and I'd rather be listening to this than other rock music that was out there with terrible lyrics, she kind of finally understood where the youth were coming from. And this kind of changed her mind. And I think that had the same effect when people saw that the young people were now getting involved in church. It really hit an emotional chord, and it really hit an understanding that we need to change the style of worship.